Welcome, everybody. My name is Chet Kerr. I'm a board member of the Irvington Historical Society, and I want to welcome everybody to today's presentation by the Irvington Historical Society entitled Madam C.J. Walker and Bill Lewaro, Making a Statement. And I want to welcome you here today. Just a couple of logistical issues, and then we'll get started. We are recording this presentation. We hope to put it up on the website in a couple of days after we're completed. And we'll have a time at the end if people have questions they want to pose, and I'll do my best to try to answer them. If you have questions as we go along, if you could put them in the chat, and then I can read them at the end and try to respond as best I can. And I'll do my best to answer them. So with that, let's get started. I have to share my screen. Give me a second to do that if I can. Okay, so let's get started if we can. And again, our talk today is Madam C.J. Walker and Bill Lewaro, and that everybody probably knows that is the back of Bill Lewaro, seen from the aqueduct, the back of her mansion here in Irvington. So I'm going to start talking about Bill Lewaro first. You know, it's a real, the home is a real jewel here in the village of Irvington. It's a 34-room, 20,000 square foot mansion that stands along the west side of Broadway as it winds through the village of Irvington. This home was built in 1917, 1918 for Madam C.J. Walker, who was widely known as America's first female Black self-made millionaire. Madam Walker, however, was more than just a successful businesswoman, and that's what I really want to focus on today. She was an interpreter, an entrepreneur, a civil rights activist, and a strong advocate for the success of Black women across the United States. And her decision to build Bill Lewaro among the large estates that border Broadway at the time was, I think, a really strong statement about her place as a successful Black woman in America. And I think to really understand what Bill Lewaro represented when it was built and what it represents today, it's important to understand who Madam Walker was and what she accomplished in her life. I think hopefully as we go through our talk today, you'll really get what I think I've learned about her is that she was a very remarkable woman. She must have been really tough and strong and did amazing things over the course of her life. So who was Madam C.J. Walker? She was named Sarah Breedlove at birth, and she was, as I said, a really fascinating and complex woman. This is a photo of Madam Walker in 1909 at the age of 42. It was taken after she had moved to Pittsburgh in late 1907, and it was used in a feature article about Madam Walker in the Pennsylvania Negro Business Directory. And we're going to talk about that when we get there. But I just interested. This photo is really interesting. You know, it's very poised and posed. She has her hands behind her back, head's tilted, looking demure. Her hair is very well done. Beautiful dress. And it just, again, I think reflects the thoughtfulness by which she, and the way she thought about herself as she presented herself to the public, and as her business grew, and then her reach grew as well. But she came from very humble beginnings. She was born in December 1867 in Delta, Louisiana. Her parents and her 4 older siblings were slaves on a Madison Parish cotton plantation owned by a man named Robert W. Birney. And what's interesting, in 1860, Birney owned 60 slaves on his cotton plantation in Delta, Louisiana. And there were 13 slave houses, just like this one, where Sarah was born. And Delta, Louisiana was in the deep South on the east side of Louisiana on the Mississippi River on the border of Mississippi. And so during the Civil War, the Bernie plantation had been confiscated by Union soldiers in 1865. But the Breedlove family, which was Sarah, her parents, and three older brothers and an older sister, remained as sharecroppers on the land after the end of the Civil War. Sarah's mother, however, died in 1872 when Sarah was 5. Her father, Owen Breedlove, quickly remarried, but he too died in 1875 when Sarah was only 7. So she was orphaned before the age of 8. And at that point, she moved in with her older sister, Luvina, and her husband, Jesse Powell. I think living with her older sister, Luvina, was difficult. Sarah had described Jesse Powell, her brother-in-law, as cruel and having a really violent temper. It was a very hard time for a young woman to be living in this with her sister and brother-in-law. Sarah received almost no formal education as a young child. At that time, the public schools in Louisiana were closed. The state legislature in Louisiana had decided to close the public schools rather than to integrate them. And there was a Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau, which had been established by the War Department at the end of the Civil War to deal with all these newly freed slaves. But its work was pretty much done between 1865 and 1868, and it was abolished in 1872. So by the time Sarah was in grade school, the Freedmen's Bureau had disbanded its education division, and there was really no formal education that she could do as a kid in that part of Louisiana. In 1878, Jesse and Luvina Powell, along with 10-year-old Sarah, moved from Delta, Louisiana, across the Mississippi River to Vicksburg, Mississippi. Now, both Jesse and Luvina were illiterate, and because of racial tensions in that area of Louisiana during Reconstruction and the failure of the cotton crop in 1878, 1879, they were forced to leave the farm and look for jobs in Vicksburg. In Vicksburg, Sarah picked cotton, washed clothes, and did housework. But at the age of 14, she married a man named Moses McWilliams. And on June 6th, several years later, she gave birth to her daughter, Layla McWilliams. And Sarah later suggested that she had decided to get married to Moses McWilliams to get a home of my own, but likely to escape living with her sister and brother-in-law. Unfortunately, Moses Williams died 2 years later, leaving Sarah at the age of 20, orphaned, widowed, and the mother of a 2-year-old. And so in 1889, Sarah and her daughter Layla moved to St. Louis, Missouri, which was the hometown at that point of her older brothers, Alexander, James, and Solomon, who owned a family barbershop. In St. Louis, Sarah worked as a laundrywoman, earning less than $1 a day. In 1894, after she'd been in St. Louis for a couple of years, she married her second husband, a man named John Davis. Unfortunately, Davis turned out to be a heavy drinker and a womanizer, and he was very unfaithful to Sarah. And for about 10 years of marriage, he claimed that she had abandoned him and he moved in with some girlfriend. And it's unclear if they were ever actually divorced. And that becomes an issue later on, as we'll hear about in a later marriage for Sarah. So Sarah's living in St. Louis, and in 1902, a woman named Annie Turnbow moved to St. Louis and set up a hairdressing shop. Miss Turnbow had lived in Illinois for a number of years and had started a hair growing business that she was trying to expand, and she moved to St. Louis to try and do that. And she met Sarah and began treating Sarah for hair loss, which Sarah had struggled with for many years. And like, many women at the time, Sarah probably only washed her hair once a month and maybe didn't wash it at all during the winter. And the result of that was a very common problem of rampant scalp disease. So she started getting treated by Annie Turnbow, and I think it helped her a great deal. And by excuse me, by 1903, Sarah began working as one of Annie Turnbow's sales agents in St. Louis, selling Pope Turnbow hair product door to door in commission. And this became a model, as we'll hear, that Sarah later used to expand her business as well. Um, However, she decided to leave St. Louis, possibly because of the collapse of her marriage to John Davis. She had a sister-in-law, Lucy Breedlove Crockett, who lived in Denver, Colorado with her 4 daughters. So in July of 1905, Sarah boarded a train and headed west. And after moving to Denver and briefly working as a cook, she began selling Annie Turnbow's Robertson Pope's products full-time in Denver, again, doing it on a commission basis. In addition, shortly after, about a year after moving to Denver, she married her 3rd husband, a man named Charles Joseph Walker, who was an advertising salesman she had actually met in St. Louis. He followed her to Denver after she moved there, and on January 1906, they got married. It was not clear at that time, however, she had ever divorced John Davis, which, again, as I said, was a bit of an issue, but it was kind of, that was what she did to get to marry this new man. Within months of starting to sell hair products full-time in Denver, however, Madam C.J. Walker began advertising a wonderful hair grower, a product of Madam C.J. Walker. And she later claimed that the inspiration for this product came from a dream. You know, Sarah would tell women as she was going out and trying to sell her own products that she had a dream in which a big black man appeared and told her what to mix for her hair. And some of the remedy was from Africa, and she sent away and mixed those elements into her hair products. And she claimed that within weeks of starting to use this new product, her hair was being restored. And it was a very powerful story, and one that she used very effectively as she was trying to encourage women to try her products and sell her products around. According to Sarah's great-great-granddaughter, Alelia Bundles, however, while both Annie Turnbow and Sarah made much of their proprietary mixtures, the real secret to their hair treatment was regular shampooing and using an easily duplicated sulfur-based formula that neither of them had originated. But Sarah was off on her own to try and expand her business. And here's a couple of examples of some of her products. These are actually from as you'll see, they say Indianapolis, Indiana, and so these are from later years, but it's the same product she was selling while she was in St. Louis. On the left is the wonderful hair grower, which was her basic way of letting your hair grow longer. And on the right was teeter sol. And teeter was the common name for psoriasis, which was, again, a very common kind of scalp disease that a lot of women had, a lot of people had, but a lot of women have. And so both these products were very successful way for her to reach out to folks. And in August 1906, Sarah's 21-year-old daughter, Layla, arrived in Denver, and together they opened a small hair salon. And Layla ran the salon while Sarah traveled around Colorado, lecturing, giving treatments, and developing a mail order business and recruiting agents to sell her products. And again, I'm going to stop here and think about this. You know, this is 1906, and Madam Walker, who again had very little formal education, but had a lot of ambition to, you know, pack up, travel around. She'd go to a new city. She'd make a point of reaching out to local churches to be introduced to women. She'd then give lectures about her products. She'd talk about how it could be treated. And it was proving a great way to kind of expand her business, a very self-directed process. And on the left's an advertisement that she was in the local Denver Statesman about how you can do a trial treatment and how this is a miracle thing that really allowed her hair to grow, which was, again, a big problem for a lot of women. So during late 1906, 1907, Madam Walker traveled extensively through the southern states, not just Colorado, but all across the South, doing demonstrations of her products and expanding the reach of her mail order business. However, with the growth of Madam Walker's business, Annie Turnbow, who was again back in St. Louis, challenged her, and so she sent letters to the local Denver press saying, beware of imitations, and basically suggesting that Madam Walker had stolen her formula. And then in May of 1907, Annie Turnbow announced she was sending a new agent to Denver to promote Annie Turnbow's products. And a short time later, there was an announcement in the Denver Statesman that the Walkers were permanently closing their salon and moving to the new city. I think in many ways it was a very calculated move by Madam Walker at the time. Denver had a relatively small Black population, and I think Madam Walker believed that she could do better in a larger, perhaps northeastern city where there was a larger population of customers for her to sell her products. Madam Walker traveled for a while, and then she ultimately, with her daughter Layla, settled in Pittsburgh and opened a factory and beauty school, which she called Layla College, to train hair culturists. And this is, on the left, is a picture of Layla College as it was in Pittsburgh in 1908. And on the right is an authorized agent's sign that she would give to her agents across the country who were selling her products. Now, in 1907, just before she moved to Pittsburgh, Madam Walker had sales of about $3,600, actually $3,652 per year, which is worth about $115,000 today. And while that is a gross income number, it's pretty remarkable. At that time, most working Black women made only between $100 and $250 per year gross. And even white men working in factories only made $500 to $700 per year. So through all her own initiative, she was growing a business that was providing her, obviously taking out some costs, but a tremendously large income, an incredible income at the time. And while she was in Pittsburgh, there was a merchant and activist named James H.W. Howard, who really wanted to focus and highlight the combined business capital of the Black community in Pittsburgh. And really was doing that to encourage Black and white merchants to hire young Black men and women into the labor force. So he published at the time this Pennsylvania Negro Business Directory. And on the right, you'll see the picture we looked at before, which was the picture that Madam Walker chose to be in her part of this directory. And it's interesting, in describing the business opportunities for Blacks in Pittsburgh, the directory notes there are over 200 Black-owned businesses in the city, and there are 4 persons, one of whom is a woman, who have a combined wealth of over $300,000. And $300,000 in 1910 is equal to the purchasing power of about $9.4 million today. So again, he was basically saying, we have these incredibly successful people, and focusing on 4 of them, one of whom was Mrs. Walker. And then the directory included short articles about 12 leaders in the business community, and it was Mrs. Walker and 11 men. And again, I think about, now this is in Pittsburgh, 1908. She's been in business for about 6 or 7 years, and it's incredible what she's done. Incredible what she's done in an environment where there was a tremendous amount of racism in the country at the time and sexism. And it was very hard for women, I think, to map out on their own to create business opportunities. And yet she had really found a way of doing it. In 1910, however, she and her husband decided to move to Indianapolis. It turned out Indianapolis was kind of the center of the country in terms of rails, and it provided a really great place to be centered, given her mail order business around the country. So she and her husband, CJ, moved to Indianapolis, and they purchased a large 12-room house, which is shown here with Mrs. Walker standing in front of it. And there was space for a hair salon and a school and a separate factory for manufacturing hair products. Now, this is a pretty extraordinary house. It had indoor plumbing and steam heat, which were luxuries for the time. And again, just to highlight the growth of her business, between the period of 1907, when she first moved to Pittsburgh, and 1910, when she moved to Indianapolis, her income from her business had increased every year. And by the end of 1910, she was making about $11,000 a year gross, which is equal to about $350,000 today, adjusted for inflation. Again, just a tremendous, remarkable business steps. And one of her real successes was creating these Walker agents. And so she continued to travel around and advertise her business across multiple states. And when she'd get to a state, she'd try to be introduced to the local community. She would hold programs, and she would give lectures and do demonstrations and try to encourage women in that locale to become Walker's agents. She became well known through Black communities all across the United States. And these Walker agents were encouraged to promote Walker's philosophy of cleanliness and loveliness as a mean of advancing the status of Afro-Americans. And she actually offered cash prizes to the local organization of agents who had been the most generous to Afro-American community. And so again, really promoting a sense of responsibility in the business to give back to the community in a strong way. And this is an advertisement when her business had been moved to Indianapolis of her various products she was selling. There were her Madam C.J. Walker's preparations. You'll see that in the upper category, on the second from the left, that's her hair grower. And the second from the right is her teeter salve, which are both hair products. But if you see, the preparation says, if you want beauty of complexion and loveliness of hair. And the bottom row, there's three, there's a cold cream, a vanishing cream, and a cleansing cream. And so she was branching out and providing both things for your complexion and for your hair and selling these products through her mail order business. In 1912, while traveling across Alabama to promote her business, she decided to visit the Tuskegee Institute and introduce herself to Booker T. Washington. Now, at the time, the Tuskegee Institute was actually been founded in 1880 by a man named Lewis Adams, who was a former slave and a very successful tradesman in Alabama. And he actually had agreed to deliver Afro-American voters in the 1880 election in exchange for a land grant to start a school. And when he then started the school, he hired Booker T. Washington as the school's principal. And Washington, in turn, brought a large number of Afro-American professionals to teach at the school. And at this time, even in 1912, Booker T. Washington was one of, if not the dominant Afro-American leader in the country, and had been so from the early 1890s through actually till his death in 1915. And he was somebody who advocated for long-term educational economic advancement in the Black community, but while not really pressing against and not seeking to challenge segregation. That was the balance he decided to take. But what's interesting is that Madam Walker decided that independent of her business interests, she wanted to meet Booker T. Washington. He was a leader in her Afro-American community, and she wanted to meet him, become connected to him, and kind of hear more about what he was doing. Now, in June of 1912, Madam Walker began really making her mark and raising her voice at a national level. And again, going back to the title of this talk is about making a statement. I think it's at this point, and maybe a couple of years earlier, where Madam Walker was trying to advance her business, but also saw herself as a vocal voice for women and the Black community in the United States. And so she traveled to Virginia for the National Association of Colored Women convention. And there she met Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an American educator and a civil rights leader. Mary Bethune had actually a very similar background to Madam Walker. She had been born in 1875 in Maysville, South Carolina. She was the 15th of 17 children in her family. It's hard to conceive of. And like Madam Walker, her parents and many of her older siblings had been slaves. Mary Bethune became a teacher, and in 1904, she founded the Literary and Industrial Training School for Negro girls in Daytona, Florida. And Madam Walker became good friends with Mary Bethune and a big supporter of Mary's school in Daytona. And at this convention, the NACW convention, Madam Walker was kind of formally introduced and gave and received and gave a very well-received speech. And as I said, she and Mary Bethune became close friends over the years. Again, I think I stop and think about Madam Walker reaching out to people as she goes through her travels across the country, and making and building these relationships was a tremendous skill, and it really helped her in her business and helped her in her political advocacy as well. However, in August 1912, she traveled to Chicago to attend the National Negro Business League convention. Booker T. Washington, who she met the year before, was the president of the National Negro Business League, and he controlled the convention's agenda. And Madam Walker wanted to go and I think be recognized by the convention as a business leader in her own right. But despite several requests by convention delegates, Washington ignored her and ignored her request to address the convention. And on the last day of the convention, Madam Walker was fed up with this, and she decided to just rise from the audience and seize the floor and addressed Washington and all the delegates. And this slide shows some of her speech, which I just kind of want to highlight. Sure, you're not going to shut the door in my face. I feel I am a credit to the business. I'm a business that is a credit to the womanhood of our race. I went into a business that is despised, that is criticized, and talked about by everybody, the business of growing hair. I am a woman that comes from the cotton fields of the South. I was promoted from there to Washtub. I'm not ashamed of my past. I'm not ashamed of my humble beginnings. Everybody told me I was making a mistake by going to this business, but I know how to grow hair as well as know how to grow cotton. I'm a woman who started in business 7 years ago with only $1.50. This year, I've taken in $18,000. Now, my object in life is not simply to make money for myself or to spend it on myself in dressing or running around in an automobile, but I love to use a part of what I make in trying to help others. So I think about this speech, and honestly, the guts it must have taken for her at a time where, again, women were finding it hard to have their voices heard, even in the Black community, of seizing the moment, standing up, and having this large convention where she had been ignored really recognize her. And I think it reflects a steeliness, a strength in her that continued to unfold as she grew and got older. At the same time, however, I think she and her daughter Layla were having a lot of personal challenges because of C.J. Walker's infidelity. That's her third husband. Madam Walker ultimately obtained a divorce in late 1912. C.J. actually had this very well-known affair with one of Madam Walker's agents from the South, and that was kind of the knife that ended that relationship. And 2 years earlier, her daughter Leia's marriage to a man named John Robinson, who she had married, had also effectively ended when he abandoned her. Interesting, in October 1912, Layla, who was then 27 years old and childish, adopted a fatherless 13-year-old named Fairy Mae Bryant, who had previously served as a model for Madam Walker's products. And on the right, that's a picture of Fairy Mae at the time as a young woman. She had this long, luxurious hair, which was great for Madam Walker to use to promote her products. Now, Fairy Mae had grown up in Noblesville, Indiana, and in the summer, she used to come and go visit her grandmother, who actually lived in Indianapolis down the street from Madam Walker. And I think that's how they originally met. And when the Walkers originally proposed to adopt Fairy Mae's mother was very reluctant to do that. But she had actually grown up without a father however, and she knew how difficult it would be and how difficult it would be for Fairy May. And so she finally agreed to the adoption, thinking it would offer Fairy May kind of more opportunities. And for their part, Madam Walker and Layla agreed that they would not only continue Fairy May's education, they would also train her to run their business. Now, in July of 1913, Booker T. Washington came back to Indianapolis. And when he did, he agreed to stay at Madam Walker's house during that trip. And that was a big event. To have a person like Booker T. Washington come and stay in your home was a real recognition. I think it was a real way that they kind of reconciled with each other. And this photograph is at the dedication of a YMCA in Indianapolis, and Madam Walker contributed $1,000 toward the project to build out this YMCA. And she was really big at getting donations from others. And that was a lot of money at the time for anybody, a lot of money for someone in her position. And yet it reflected her both, I think, desire to make an impact and a recognition that her money could make an impact as she kind of promoted the ideas of developing a place like the YMCA. And that year at the National Negro Business League Convention in Philadelphia, Booker T. Washington this time invited her to speak, and she was saluted by Washington as a striking example of the possibilities of Negro womanhood in the business world. And again, quite a turnaround from the prior years at the prior year convention. Now, in the fall of 1913, Madam Walker decided to expand her business further and decided to travel to the Caribbean to lecture about her business, try to recruit agents, and again, further expand her mail order business. But with the support from her mother, Layla, her daughter, went to New York and purchased property on 136th Street in Harlem. And Layla retained Vertner Tandy, who was the first licensed Black architect in New York, design and build this large, beautiful townhouse. And this is a photo of that townhouse. It's on the north side of 136th Street, smack in the middle of Harlem. And the first floor of this townhouse included the Walker Hair Parlor and something they called Layla College, which again was a school where they would invite people to come, women to come learn how to use these products. They could then go back to their own community and start their own businesses to both do hair cultural and also sell products as well. As I said, with the success and growth of her business, Madam Walker's philanthropic role also began to expand, and her public role. And she was invited again in 1914, the National Negro Business League Convention in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And at that convention, she used her speech to push for the creation of jobs for Black women. And she was praised for her philanthropy, and Booker T. Washington convinced the convention to pass a resolution endorsing her as the foremost businesswoman of our race. And again, just thinking about where she started, less than 10 years before to where she was now at this national convention, to be recognized that way, it is just simply, I think, remarkable. And she was starting to expand as well, how her reach into the community. She was well known for sponsoring a benefit concert for a young man named Francis Spencer, who was a Black harpist, and she gave him $300 to purchase a new harp. She traveled widely across the country, lecturing, recruiting new sales agents for her business. And as I said, in her lectures, she strongly advocated for employment opportunities for Black women and highlighted the accomplishments of Afro-Americans in business and in education, referring back to her friend Mary Bethune, talking about what Booker T. Washington's been doing. And through 1914 and 1915, she traveled up and down the East Coast and the West Coast, lecturing all the way, and really giving herself a national imprint. Following Layla's move to New York City in 1913, however, Madam Walker began to kind of view New York as the place she wanted to be. It was become kind of the business manufacturing center of the country. It was home to 92,000 blacks, more than 4 times the number in Indianapolis. And so she really saw it as her business empire expand, it was good for her to be in New York and to base herself there. Her lawyer at the time, a man named Freeman Mason, and a lot of the people who were working in Indianapolis were very concerned if she left. But she said, no, I'm going to continue my base of operations in Indianapolis if I decide to move. In 1915, Booker T. Washington died, and which was again a kind of a passing of the torch. And at the time, New York was seen as the home of a kind of a new and a more vibrant and actually a more militant Black leadership, which included, for example, W.E. Du Bois, who had recently helped launch the NAACP. So there was a kind of a combination of forces that kind of led Madam Walker to think New York is where she wanted to be and needed to be. And so she decided to leave day-to-day control of her company in Indianapolis to her counsel, Freeman Ransom, and to her factory forelady, and she moved to Layla's Harlem townhouse in February of 1916. And when she got there, she just thought it was fabulous. It was just, she wrote to Freeman Ransom, her attorney, said, you just can't believe what's going on here in New York. It's a beautiful, wonderful place. This is an interesting photo. This is, again, her townhouse in Harlem, and that car in front of her is a Cole touring car. It was manufactured by the Cole Motor Company, which was an early automobile maker in Indianapolis. And that was a very luxurious car, and she had purchased it, and she had a chauffeur, and she would use that car to drive on a lot of her travels across country. She either traveled by train or by car. This is a limited edition Cole automobile. It had a very powerful 40 horsepower engine. And as I said, she had a chauffeur driving it. It was, again, very much a statement of who she was and where she was coming from and what she'd become. Now, her support of the NAACP grew at this time, and again, reflecting her growing understanding of the importance of supporting civil rights and pushback to what was very strong Jim Crow laws across the country, and specifically try to respond to a wide number of lynchings across the country. And in 1916, she contributed to the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign, and her contribution was publicly cited to by the first NAACP board chairman. And she was later asked to join an NAACP committee that organized a very famous silent protest march in New York City held to protest lynchings across the country. And these lynchings were again, very controversial. Obviously, they were just horrific. And the Black community was really trying to challenge them as a real example of the degradation of the Black community in the United States and pushing back against just the terror that it promoted for people across the country. She also recognized the power of collective action. And she decided when she moved to New York to start something she called the Madam C.J. Walker Benevolent Association, which kind of became her association of all her agents. And she really saw that she had these agents all across the country, and she could really harness the collective power of them. And her goals were business oriented. She wanted to help the agents learn how to increase their sales, of course, but her goals were also charitable. And she was very much into promoting and conveying to her agents all across the country the importance of charitable causes, because she thought it was good for business, but good for the community as well. And she actually proposed kind of creating annual prizes for groups of agents with the largest number of new agents, the highest sales, and the greatest philanthropy. And on the left is an example of one of her awards about reflecting the National Beauty Culturist and Benevolent Association of Madam C.J. Walker agents. She was very thoughtful, very smart, very strategic in how she was using her growing business empire to reflect her growing awareness of political and social advocacy. And in 1917, she held the first convention of Walker's agents. It was held in Philadelphia. And this is a picture of the convention members in Philadelphia at that convention. And at the convention, the opening speech was given by the mayor of Philadelphia, which again is just, it's remarkable of her ability to bring in people like that to support her work. It was seen as a real model of running a nationwide business. And as I said, reflecting a broader set of social concerns as well. And her speech to the convention, I think, is also a really telling point. There are over 200 delegates that come across the country to Philadelphia for this convention. And as I said, the Philadelphia's mayors had often welcomed the remarks. And the final night of the convention, she really spoke about highlighting her agent's success, but also that the agents need to go out and protest inequality. And I just want to read this. This is the greatest country under the sun, but we must not let our love of country, our patriotic loyalty, cause us to abate one whit in our protest against wrong and injustice. We should protest until the American sense of justice is so aroused that such affairs as the East St. Louis riot be forever impossible. And what that's a reference to was earlier in 1917, there had been a lot of labor unrest in St. Louis. And there were a couple of incidents that led to this enormous riot and a race-based violence by white Americans who killed somewhere between 50 and 150 Afro-Americans in late May and early July of 1917. Again, it was just horrific examples of a racism that was all across the country. And her willingness to speak up about it, and her suggestion that her agents, who were her group of folks across the country, should make it part of their goals to also raise their voices against it. Now, when she had done an earlier visit to New York, and as I said, she had moved to New York to live with Layla at her Harlem townhouse. She had actually, at an earlier visit, had briefly considered purchasing a large 4-story home in Flushing, Long Island, but she ultimately abandoned that idea. Actually, when the word got out that she was thinking about buying the house, the local community did some zoning changes right around the house that made the house much less attractive, and just she didn't want to buy it anymore. So in the summer of 1916, she seized upon another opportunity, and through intermediaries, she purchased for $40,000 a 4.297-acre estate property in Irvington, our community. At that time, Irvington was one of the wealthiest communities in the United States. Now, $40,000 in 1916 is equal to about $1.1 million today. And that was to buy an estate that, as we'll hear, she tore down the existing structure to build a new one. And she retained Vertner Tandy, again, the same Black architect that had built the townhouse in Harlem for Layla, to design a new, large, prominent mansion. Now, this is a map of Irvington from 1910. And this is, you'll see down the bottom left, that's kind of the Main Street part of Irvington and Broadway running through. And Irvington at that time was chock full of large estates by wealthy New Yorkers who used for a lot of summer estates. And this is where Madam Walker decided to both purchase her property and build her new home. And right in the middle, you'll see the reference to Daniel L. McElroy. That's where she purchased her property. She actually only purchased the property that was between Broadway and the Aqueduct. That's the 4.2-acre. But it's still a very large piece of property, very prominent in the community, well recognized in the community. And Daniel McElroy had been a tax commissioner in New York City, and was, again, a well-known person in the community. He had died a couple of years before, and it was sold by his estate to Madam Walker. And so after purchasing the property in 1917, she began the process of building a new Italianate style mansion. And it was big news in Irvington at the time. And if you kind of look around, these articles are all from the Irvington Gazette. The one in the upper left notes that she had bought his property. She was references a wealthy colored woman. They said she was planning to take McElroy's property and convert it into a home for colored orphans. That was not true. And then the one on the upper right about how the mansion was nearing completion, that the mansion was going to cost about $100,000, which was a tremendous amount at the time. And they say that she's worth about $2 million, and that was largely inaccurate. She was not worth that at the time, but she was obviously a very wealthy businesswoman. And interestingly, in the bottom left, there is a small article about an Aeolian company, which is an organ company, installing an organ in Madam Walker's home. And the organ that she put in there was a very specialized one. It was about a $10,000 organ, which is just, again, a tremendous sum of money for a musical instrument at the time. And it was installed in her home, and it's actually still in her home. It doesn't operate at this time, I believe, but it's still there. It's in the big music room on the south parlor in the home. But it was an example of Madam Walker really looking to see her home as a place to both entertain and be a demonstration for the community of what the possibilities were. This is a picture of Villa Lewaro as it was being constructed. This is looking kind of west-northwest. That is the front of the home. And what is remarkable about how she decided to both build this mansion and place this mansion, she had Vertner Tandy kind of put it, right facing Broadway. It was there. You could see it. And again, kind of making a statement in her community about who she was and what she did. And I think again a lot about how hard that could be for a lot of people, facing the social realities of the time, the Black racism that was still rampant across the country, the relationship between men and women, and the fact that women would have an ongoing challenge finding their role in society. And she made the decision that she was going to put this mansion front and center, and clearly state who she was in this community she'd never been in before. And this is an interesting article from the November 4th, 1917 New York Times Magazine article. And I just want to read something because it kind of reflects a little bit of what Irvington's reaction to all this was. When the home, that's her Villa Lewaro, was finished to be one of the show places on the Hudson. Of late, Madam Walker and her high-powered motor car has been a familiar visitor in Irvington. On her first visits to inspect her property, the villagers, noting her color, were frankly puzzled. Later, when it became known that she was the owner of the pretentious dwelling, they could only gasp in astonishment. Impossible, they exclaimed. No woman of her race could afford such a place. To say that the village, when the report was verified, was surprised would be putting the case mildly. What wealth is hers, she says, has been acquired through perseverance, persistency, and hard work. For her home, she could hardly have chosen a more attractive spot. The site is the most exclusive part of Irvington Village. And again, reflects a little bit of perhaps the time, who her neighbors were, a little sense of disbelief that this new mansion could be built and owned by a Black woman at the time. Again, Madam Walker making her statement. By the way, in that New York Times article, the New York Times article also said that she was a millionaire. In the article, she said, "No, I'm not there. I'm not a millionaire yet. I'm not a millionaire. I hope to be someday." But she was clearly an incredibly successful businesswoman. So Villa Lewaro had its grand opening in August of 1918, and she had the opening by inviting 100 guests for a luncheon to honor Emmett J. Scott, who was the Special Assistant for Negro Affairs to the Secretary of War. And remember, this is during World War I, and Emmett Scott was probably one of the highest level in the federal government of an Afro-American at the time. And other speakers and attendees included Mary Talbot, who was the president of the Confederation of Colored Women's Clubs, J.C. Napier, who was the president of the National Business Men's Club, and W.D. Scarborough, who was the president of Wilberforce College. And Wilberforce College was one of the nation's oldest private historically Black universities, and it was owned and operated by Afro-Americans. It was founded in 1856, and Scarborough was the president, who was thought to be one of the first Afro-American scholars, and W.D. Du Bois actually taught at the school as well. Interesting, the name Lewaro was suggested by Enrico Caruso, the opera singer. Caruso had developed a relationship and a friendship with Layla, Madam Walker's daughter. And during the spring of 1918, when she was constructing the home, Caruso came to Irvington and saw the home, and supposedly it reminded him of the estates in his native Italy. So he suggested the mansion be called Lewaro, which was based on the first two letters of Layla's original married name, Layla Walker Robinson, and that was the name that was chosen for her. At this opening, she also had Joseph Douglas, who was the grandson of Frederick Douglass, play a solo for everyone. And he was a groundbreaking Afro-American concert violinist, excuse me. And again, it reflects just her sensibility of how to combine social events, political people, music, and whatever, and how it could be used to take the Lewaro as a real beacon for her community. In January 1919, Madam Walker hosted the first meeting of the International League of Darker Peoples at Lewaro, which was created to bring together Afro-Americans with other non-European people to pursue the goals of the Paris Peace Conference. Paris Peace Conference was the conference that, after the end of World War I, was to put together a peace for Europe. And she really wanted to have a role in setting the peace terms as well. And some of the attendees at Lewaro was A. Philip Randolph, who was a member of the Socialist Party and a publisher of The Messenger, which at the time was this very radical Black magazine. And Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., who was the pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, and Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican political activist and a Black nationalist. And what's interesting, I think, is that Madam Walker was beginning to work with several of the most outspoken and perceived radical civil rights leaders of the day. You know, for example, Philip Randolph, as I said, he was a member of the Socialist Party and was an active union organizer. His magazine, The Messenger, was described by the Department of Justice as the most able and most dangerous of all Negro publications at the time. Marcus Garvey, he was a Jamaican political activist, but a strong proponent of racial separation between Blacks and whites, and was very outspoken in challenging the supremacy of the white community in the United States at the time. Now, Madam Walker had hoped to travel to the Paris Peace Conference herself, but her passport application was denied, possibly because of her connections to the IDLP. The IDLP was seen by the Justice Department as a kind of a dangerous radical entity. Now, 5 days after hosting this big event at Lewaro, she then hosted a meeting at the Waldorf Astoria between the IDLP delegates and Shiroku Kuroda, a member of the Japanese delegation to the Paris Peace Conference. And again, I just looked at this photograph, and she's the only woman in the photograph, a lot of distinguished international people. And I stop and think again how remarkable it is that Madam Walker, coming from where she did, developing her business, developing her relationships, finding her voice in the broader community, take on this role. Again, she must have been a remarkable woman. Now, it's possible, interesting, the IDLP, it's possible that a founding member, again, Reverend Jonas, was an agent for the FBI, kind of infiltrating the IDLP and trying to figure out what was going on. And Madam Walker's lawyer, Freeman Ransom, had kind of advised her to that not perhaps she might want to cut her association with the IDLP because of its radical ideas. And she only took this, she also decided to do that in February of 19, she stepped away. So again, it reflects her willingness to embrace a lot of radical ideas, but a level of sophistication as well about how it can negatively impact her. Now, in March of 1919, Madam Walker started a long trip to the Midwest, but while in St. Louis, she became very ill. I think she was a diabetic and was suffering from kidney failure. And she decided to return to Lewaro. And while she took a train back to Lewaro, and at that time, when she got back in early May, there was a big NAACP convention in New York City against trying an anti-lynching campaign. And she was able to continue to support it financially, but she was restricted to her bedroom by her doctors. And what's interesting, in addition to giving a $1,000 check to support the anti-lynching campaign, she also pledged $5,000 to the NAACP fight against mob violence. And that was the largest gift given to the NAACP up to that point. And she was well recognized in the convention. Unfortunately, on May 24th, 1919, she slipped into a coma and she died the following day. And this is less than a year than Lewaro was completed, and she had less than a year of living in that home. And she was 51 years old when she died. Now, in the weeks before her death, knowing that she was very ill, she and her attorney, Freeman Ransom, had drafted some codicils to her will. And she bequeathed to her daughter Layla the Harlem townhouse and a third of the profits of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. And the remaining 2/3 of the company's net proceeds were to be divided equally between trusts to maintain Lewaro and for the benefit of worthy charities. And she also left a wide range of individual bequests to family members and friends. And finally, and most importantly, she put in her will that upon Layla's death, that Lewaro would be transferred to the NAACP or to such other organization that her trustees judge was doing the most for racial uplift. Again, reflecting a real desire by her to make a mark to advance the civil rights issues and the women's rights issues that she was a big proponent of. So with her mother's death, Layla Walker became the president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. And while she continued to oversee Layla College, which was at her 136th Street townhouse, and work with the Walker's agents, her interests were really drawn to the more of the social and cultural life in Harlem. And she developed this wide group of friends, including the photographer Carl Van Vetchen, poet Langston Hughes, and a whole bunch of other people. And she became kind of the hostess of the moment in Harlem for the Harlem Renaissance. And she also traveled widely. And she took a long trip to Europe in 1922. And when she returned to the United States, she decided to change her name to Alelia Walker. That's how she was known from that point going forward. And on the left is a picture of Alelia Walker in 1926. In the middle is Langston Hughes, who was a poet he had been a student at Columbia University in 1921 and 22 and then dropped out because he wanted to write poetry. Became very active in the kind of life of Harlem. And on the right is County Cullen, who was another poet and was also deeply involved in the Harlem Renaissance. And they both came into the orbit of Layla and kind of were in her social circles, as were many other artists and individuals and intellectuals. I think she was quite a presence in the Harlem scene and the Harlem Renaissance. But she also maintained and used Lewaro up in Irvington and acted as the hostess of it. And she hosted a number of events, a very famous July 4th celebration for the Liberian president, C.B.D. King. She was famous for holding lavish Christmas dinners. And she, I think, like her mother, realized that it really presented an opportunity to make a statement about who she was, where she fit into the community, and the like. And this is a picture from 1924 of another conventions of the beauty agents, the Walker beauty agents, and they were actually at Villa Lewaro. This is the back of the home, which you can still see today. Again, quite an assemblage of folks. Unfortunately, the Madam C.J. Walker over the course of the 20s began to decline. It did reasonably well in the immediate aftermath of Madam Walker's birth, but there were more competition. Annie Turnbow, the old Annie Turnbow's business was getting more broad, wider as well. And I think supposedly Aurelia Walker's apparent lack of business ambition, she didn't have the drive her mother had. And then the 1929 market crash really caused the Walker Company's revenues to fall. And maintaining Villa Lewaro, which was the responsibility of the Walker estate, proved to be very expensive and really difficult. And so in 1930, they actually auctioned off the contents of Villa Lewaro, all the interior furniture and like, but they only netted $58,000 in 3 days, which, you know, was a lot of money, but not as much as they might have hoped for. And in fact, in May of 1931, the mansion was put up for sale and put up for auction, but the Walker estate took the highest bid and kept the property. And there was some suggestions that they were going to turn the hotel into a hotel for Negroes or an art museum, or try to get the NAA's permission to sell the property. There were a number of things in the local papers, I think, that were being pressed by local real estate agencies, hoping to get access to the home, perhaps to raise some concern in the community about what would happen to it in the future. But in August of 1931, Aurelia Walker died. She had a cerebral hemorrhage, and she died at the age of 46. And as I said earlier, in Madam Walker's will, the trustees of her estate were required to transfer Villa Lewaro to the NAACP or another similar organization. Now, this was the middle of the Depression. Villa Lewaro was an incredibly expensive home to maintain, and the NAACP did not want to acquire and take on that responsibility. So Freeman Ransom, again, who had been Madam Walker's attorney and was one of the trustees of her estate, arranged to have Villa Lewaro transfer to the NAACP, and then immediately transferred to a woman named Annie Poth, who was the Secretary General of the Companions of the Force, for use of the home as a rest home for women. So it then became the Annie E. Poth Home for Tired Mothers, Convalescents, and the Aged. And the Companions of the Foresters of America was a social and kind of benevolent fraternal organization created in 1883 as a woman's auxiliary to the Foresters of America. You know, at this time in the United States, there were actually a large number of fraternal organizations that people would join, often for business relationships and friendships, but also it became a kind of a low-cost insurance for the costs of funerals and burial in the future. There was no Social Security. There was not kind of widely available life insurance. And one of the biggest costs people were faced with, or a family was faced with upon the death of a relative, was having a funeral, having a burial, buying a plot. And so these social and benevolent fraternal organizations were created where you could put a small amount of money in and they would collectively provide this money. And the Companions of the Foresters of America was that, along as a business relationship. And Annie Poth was, as I said, was the National Supreme Secretary and the Financial Secretary for the Companions, and had been involved for many years. So the home was sold to her, and a couple months later, she sold it to the Companions of the Foresters to become this home for tired mothers. And interestingly, the Companions operated their home for tired mothers at Villa Lewaro for 56 years, from 1931 to 1987, here in our village, throughout that entire time. But things were changing, and in 1987, the Companions sold Villa Lewaro to Ingo and Darlene Appel. And Ingo Appel was a doctor. And then 6 years later, the Appels sold the mansion to Harold E. Doley and Helena Doley, his wife. Harold Doley was an investment banker. He was the founder of Doley Securities, and he was the only Afro-American at that point to own a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. He was also a co-funder of the U.S. Africa Chamber of Commerce, and was actually accorded a bachelor rank when he was serving as a representative to the American Development Bank and Fund. And he was recognized by the federal government, recognized by President Bush. He was appointed to Presidential Board of Advisors on historically Black and college universities, member of the Council of Foreign Relationships, and served a lot of boards. He was quite a man, very, very accomplished, a remarkable man. And the Doleys, Harold and Helena Doley, they owned Villa Lewaro for 25 years. And they, I think, at least what I know, they were very devoted stewards of protecting and preserving the mansion. And they worked to restore the home and its contents to as close to the original condition as they could. There were some changes. They had to move the kitchen around. The kitchen had been in the basement. They had to move it around, whatever like that. But they, under their tutelage, the property was designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1976. And then in 2014, Harold and his family partnered with the National Trust for Historical Preservation to develop a plan to protect the mansion as an important part, I think, of our community's cultural heritage and the wider cultural heritage as well. And then in March of 2017, Harold and the National Trust for Historic Preservation executed a deed, preservation and conservation easement to preserve and maintain Villa Lewaro and its surrounding property in perpetuity. And that deed of preservation and conservation easement applies today and really helps protect the property going forward. And they held a lot of great events. On the left is an event they held in 1998 for a benefit for the Chicago United Negro College Fund. And the Doleys were also famous for holding Juneteenth celebrations of Villa Lewaro, which they did for a number of years as well. But in 2018, the Doley family decided they had to sell, and they sold Villa Lewaro to an LLC controlled by Richelieu Dennis, Richelieu Dennis is the owner of Essence Magazine, the founder of Sundial Brands, and the co-founder of the New Voices Fund, an investment fund that focused on women of color entrepreneurs. And in connection with this, the Sundial Brands relaunched Madam Walker's brand of hair care products is under the name Madam by Madam C.J. Walker. And Dennis, his picture of Dennis there, said that he hoped that working with the New Voices Foundation, he wanted to use Villa Lewaro as a learning institute to foster entrepreneurship for women of color. If you think back to Madam Walker's goal of working and creating her benevolent association for all of her agents, trying to help them learn to get a trade, make money, become successful business women. This is a real, what comes around's come around. This is I think kind of matches a lot of what Madam Walker's original vision was. And in last July, 2023, the Village of Irvington Board of Trustees granted a special permit for the adaptive reuse of Villa Lewaro as historical, educational, and cultural facility. And Villa Lewaro and that part of the village is in a zone for single-family housing. But the Irvington trustees, a couple of years before, had passed a code provision that allowed historical homes that were zoned for single-family housing, to apply for a special permit that would allow them to be readapted for other uses as well. And a great example of that is the Octagon House here in Irvington. Joe Lombardi and his family had worked to really renovate and turn the Octagon House, which is this great historic home, into a beautiful spot. They were the first to receive one of these special permits, and allows them to run tours of their home and still live in it in a great way. And that's what Dennis has done now with Villa Lewaro as well. And this special permit specifically authorizes the Madam C.J. Walker Institute for Women of Color Entrepreneurs, which is a 501c3, to use the mansion and grounds to provide educational programming that is tailored to the specific needs and perspectives of traditionally underserved women. Now, the special permit, there's certain conditions that have to be met that I think they're still being worked on, have not yet been met. So the special permit hasn't come into actual force as of yet, but I think it's it's reading that the goal of this organization is echoing back to what Madam Walker wanted to do and was interested in doing in her life. Part of what she wanted to build Lewaro for. I think it's a really wonderful. The world comes around in a way, in a great way. So that's kind of the end of my presentation. And as I said, we probably have some time for a few questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I see we've got some questions in the chat. So let me see if I can turn to those and do my best to answer them if I can. So there's a comment that Freeman Briley Ransom was Madam Walker's attorney, and he challenged the so-called adoption of Fairy Mae Bryant. That's actually true. And I don't really know all the details off the top of my head about why, but that was a long legal challenge that continued for quite a while. Let's just kind of read. Should be, I'm trying to look for questions. There's several comments in here. This is from Miriam Sivek. She says the story belongs nationally in all historic textbooks. I learned about Bethune, Mary Bethune, we talked about, in Booker, Washington, and this is part of it. And I agree. I actually think that as I've learned a lot about this story, it's a really remarkable story. It's a remarkable story about this woman. It's a remarkable story about what she accomplished. It's a remarkable story about our community. The fact that this house is still here after over 100 years old is really fabulous. And so a couple other questions. Is there any evidence that the hair growing products worked? I've never tried for hair. I don't have enough hair to do that. But I have to say this, her business was very successful. So I understand and I believe that it was very successful. Now, whether or not there was some real magic in the formula or use of the formula along with some of the kind of lifestyle changes that she promoted, as she said, of cleanliness and loveliness, combined to really help women who were having hair problems, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in all this stuff, but I think the proof's in the pudding. She expanded her business widely. She would go and lecture and show people how this worked. She convinced women to both use it in their own hair and become agents. And it's pretty remarkable. So there's a question, when and how did she learn to read and write? So there was some suggestion that even though she didn't have any formal education as a young child, possibly in church, she had learned her letters in church. I think she later on had taken courses as an adult, but exactly when she learned to read and write, I'm not exactly sure. For questions like this, actually, I can make a suggestion to folks. There's a fabulous book about Madam Walker called On Her Own Ground, which was written by Aurelia Bundles, who was her great-great-granddaughter. And it's a wonderful book to read if you want to know more about Madam Walker, and I really encourage you to get the book and read it. So what happened to the Harlem townhouse? It's my understanding it was sold and torn down. It's some new, more modern building. The townhouse is no longer there. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what organization's there, but I think it's no longer there. And so there's a question, have you learned anything about Walker's reception in Irvington or her interactions with her neighbors? I actually have looked a lot for this. There's the kind of references in the New York Times Magazine article that I referenced. I have found nothing in the recorded, I've looked all through the Irvington Gazette. I've looked for local materials to see if there's any public comments. And there's not. And I think a couple things behind that, and I don't know what the reaction was by her other neighbors along Broadway. The reality is that history is written by the winners. It's often written about people who are perceived as kind of prestigious in their community, and is often very not critical of them. And if there was criticism at the time, either there was not a vehicle by which that was publicized, or if it was, that's not part of the history that's been saved. So I'm not sure. Interesting, at this time, there was another estate, the Guteau estate, which was a little below Main Street on the east side of Broadway. And the Guteau estate was sold in about after he died, just about the time Madam Walker was buying her property. And a local group of wealthy landowners created a homeowners association corporation to buy that property. And they held it for a couple of years, and then they sold it, I believe, in 1917 or 1918. And in that deed, there is a statement that this property could not be sold to anybody who is Black. And that is the only time that I found, and I've looked at a lot of indentures, that I found those kinds of restricted covenants in an indenture in Irvington. And it's interesting, kind of the timing of it with Madam Walker's appearance on the scene. Now, whether that's the result of one or the other, I'm not sure. But it is, I was not sure. But it's just an interesting side note on what was going on in our community. And then, will Ville Lewaro be open for tours under this new permit? I believe a condition of the permit is that the home has to become open to the public once or twice a year, and exactly how that's going to happen and when it'll be happen will be up to Mr. Dennis Richelieu, or Richelieu Dennis, excuse me, Mr. Dennis. But that is a condition of the permit, but how it happens is will have to yet be seen. Someone says, tell me more about the building, square footage, number of rooms, number of stories. Again, I think it's 34 rooms, 20,000 square feet. It's 3 stories above ground. There's a large basement area. I've actually been lucky to take a tour of the home. It's really remarkable. It's a beautiful home. It's really a fabulous place. And let's see, was Layla the only child? Yes, she is the only child. And Layla, who, and, were there any survivors? Well, what's really important here is that Layla adopted Fairy May, and then Fairy May had children, and then she had a daughter named Alelia Bryant, and then that daughter again had a daughter who's now Alelia Bundles. And I'm not sure if there's other living relatives, but Alelia Bundles is currently, who's a great scholar and a real scholar on Madam Walker. But she is alive, and you can find out if you put her into Google, you can get to her website and hear more about Madam Walker. And so one question is, when she bought the Irvington property, were the sellers aware that she was Black? I don't know that answer to that question. When she bought the property, it was actually sold through 2 layers of intermediaries. And I don't know whether it was done that way to hide the ultimate purchaser or not. I don't know that. And then another question, when does the new Irvington permit enable the current owners to do with Ville Lewaro going forward? It's my understanding that the permit requires certain conditions be met for either a temporary C of O or a final C of O. And it's a little complicated because unlike the Octagon House, where the Lombardis are still living there, I believe the Ville Lewaro, there won't be a full-time resident there, which is kind of understood when they did the special permit, but that changes some of the code provisions. And because of that, that has made it more challenging. I know they're working on it. Mr. Dennis has hired Steve Tilley, who is this fabulous historic architect, and I know Steve's been working very hard on this, but exactly where it is, I'm not 100% sure. Interesting, I got a note from Alelia Bundles, so I will, she's on the presentation, which is just lovely to hear. For me, I'm incredibly happy that she's here and heard what we did. That was really great. And then a question, was Madam Walker ill when Lewaro was being built? I think her health wasn't great. She wasn't ill as she was at the final months of her life, where she really had kidney failure. But her health hadn't been good for a couple of years. Okay, so we've been going for a while. I've been talking for a while, and I always apologize for talking too much. But before we leave, I'm going to ask Veronica Gedrich, who's the president of the Irvington Historical Society, to come back on for a minute. I think she just has a couple of comments she wants to make, and I think to talk a little bit about some upcoming programs. So, Veronica, welcome, and maybe you can, I hope you have your microphone on and you're ready to go.
I hope so. Can you hear me, Chet?
We can hear you. It's great.
Okay. Hello, everybody. And I'm Veronica Gedrich, president of the Irvington Historical Society. Thank you, Chet, for such a wonderful program. What an incredible story. It's really amazing. And thank you all for attending today. Remember, as Chet has mentioned, this program has been recorded and will be available on our website, irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org.